Hey guys, welcome aboard to Snoozy Voyager, where tonight we're doing something that's going to sound either deeply reassuring or mildly offensive to every history teacher you've ever had. Tonight we're defending the Dark Ages. Yes, those Dark Ages. The ones with the plague and the mud and the very aggressive theology. We're arguing they weren't that dark. Or at least, not only dark. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you, and if you suggested this topic and a surprising number of you did, thank you. Genuinely. It's one of the most requested themes in our little comment section of sleepy historical chaos, and I'm glad we're finally here. Let me ask you something. Have you ever wondered what medieval people actually did all day when they weren't dying of plague? Did they have friends, hobbies, opinions about their neighbours? Was there music? Was there laughter? Was there anyone in the whole of the medieval world having a reasonably okay Tuesday? What did a marketplace smell like? What did a cathedral feel like from the inside when you'd never seen anything taller than a barn? Did people fall in love? Did they tell jokes? Did they argue about dinner? Were there people back then who were just weird in a relatable way? And here's the bigger one. What if the story of the Middle Ages, the one where everything was grim and ignorant and waiting for the Renaissance to rescue it, is, to put it diplomatically, incomplete? Congratulations! You've just woken up somewhere in medieval Europe. The year is somewhere between the 5th and 15th century, which is 1,000 years of human history that history class summarised in about 11 pages. You have no electricity, no germ theory, and no concept of weekends. But you do have art, music, trade, philosophy, love, architecture, beer, and an increasingly complicated feelings about your local bishop. Welcome to the Middle Ages. They're more interesting than anyone told you. Let's start at the very beginning, which in this case means exposing a branding problem that has lasted 700 years. The term Dark Ages wasn't coined by historians who carefully studied the period and concluded it was terrible. It was coined by Francesco Petrarch, a 14th century Italian poet who thought everything before him was inferior and wasn't shy about saying so. Petrarch looked at classical Roman Greece, decided those civilizations were the pinnacle of human achievement, and then declared everything that came after their collapse to be a kind of long cultural nap from which Europe was only just waking up in his own lifetime conveniently. It was, in short, a man with a strong personal brand calling everyone before him historically irrelevant. Petrarch was brilliant, and his poetry is genuinely beautiful, but as a historian he was doing something closer to aggressive marketing. He wanted to make the case that the Renaissance, the movement he was part of, was a glorious rebirth. And to make a rebirth dramatic, you need to establish that something died first. So he invented the death. He called it darkness. It was a rhetorical move, not a scholarly conclusion, and it has been causing problems ever since. The term stuck. Later Renaissance thinkers picked it up and ran with it. Enlightenment writers, who also had a vested interest in suggesting that history had been building toward them, kept using it. And by the time the phrase entered school curriculums, it was so embedded in how people talked about the medieval world that questioning it felt almost rude. You'd be at a dinner party and someone would say the Dark Ages and you'd have to decide whether to say anything, and most people sensibly decided to just eat their bread and let it go. That's how a bad metaphor survives for 7 centuries. Nobody has the energy to correct it, but here's what the name actually describes, stripped of its editorializing. It describes a period in Western European history where certain kinds of record-keeping became less systematic after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. There were fewer written administrative records, fewer stone inscriptions, fewer official state documents than there had been under Rome. That's it. That's the darkness. Not an absence of people doing interesting things, just an absence of a particular kind of paperwork. If you have ever cleaned out a filing cabinet and concluded that your life during the unfiled years was not worth living, you will recognize the logical error here, and the irony is rich. Because the period labelled dark was, in many parts of the world, anything but. The Islamic Golden Age was flourishing. Byzantine civilization was producing extraordinary art and philosophy. China's Tang dynasty was arguably the most sophisticated society on earth. Scholars in Baghdad were translating, preserving and extending Greek mathematical and scientific knowledge at a pace that Western Europe would not match for centuries. Even in Western Europe, which really does bear the brunt of the label, monasteries were preserving classical texts, trade networks were functioning, people were building things that still stand, and a rich oral culture of song, story and community was very much alive. The darkness was always mostly a matter of perspective, and a very particular, very Italian, very 14th century perspective at that. Petrarch was not looking at the whole world. He was looking at Western Europe through the lens of a man who loved Rome and was personally invested in the idea that his own era was special. He was not wrong that his era was interesting. He was wrong that everything before it was nothing. History is full of people who thought history started with them. Petrarch was just louder than most, and unfortunately he had very good handwriting and a lot of influential readers. The name he gave 1,000 years of human life is still with us. The least we can do is understand where it came from and take it with the enormous grain of salt it deserves. Before the printing press, before the internet, before anyone thought to back things up anywhere, there was a monk with a quill in a cold scriptorium, and he was the only thing standing between you and a world that had permanently lost Aristotle. This is not an exaggeration. When the Western Roman Empire fractured in the 5th century, it took a lot of institutional infrastructure with it. Roads, courts, administrative systems, and perhaps most crucially, the organised transmission of knowledge. Libraries that had once been maintained by Roman civic institutions either fell into disuse, burned, or were simply abandoned as cities contracted and political stability evaporated. The accumulated learning of centuries was suddenly very fragile, sitting in buildings that were no longer well maintained by people who were increasingly distracted by the problem of not being invaded. Enter the monasteries. Catholic monks, and it is worth saying, this was their job, not a hobby, copied manuscripts by hand, sometimes their entire working lives, preserving texts that would otherwise have been lost entirely. Benedictine monasteries in particular took seriously the instruction that monks should read, study and copy scripture and related works. But the texts they preserved weren't only religious. Classical philosophy, Greek medicine, Roman history, works of natural science and mathematics, all of these passed through medieval monastic scriptoriums on their way to the modern world. Without those scriptoriums, the Renaissance that supposedly rescued civilization from darkness would have had nothing to be reborn from. The rescue operation was medieval. The monks who did this work were often highly educated by the standards of their time. They learned Latin as a matter of course. Some learned Greek. They wrote commentaries on the texts they copied, argued about them, built upon them. In Northumbria in 8th century England, a monk named Bede was writing what amounts to the first systematic history of the English people, while also calculating the correct date for Easter and corresponding with scholars across Europe. He didn't have a university or a research grant or an ergonomic chair. He had a monastery and an extraordinary mind, and he used both to produce work that historians are still reading and citing today. Irish monasteries played a particularly significant role. While parts of continental Europe were experiencing their most politically chaotic periods, Ireland, never having been part of the Roman Empire and therefore less affected by its collapse, was experiencing something of a monastic golden age. Irish monks became famous throughout Europe as scholars, missionaries and travellers. They founded monasteries in Scotland, England, France, Italy and Switzerland, bringing manuscripts with them and establishing new centres of learning wherever they settled. They were, in effect, the medieval equivalent of a distributed backup system, making copies, spreading them across geography, ensuring that no single disaster could wipe out everything at once. This was not an accident. It was a strategy, even if nobody called it that. The word scriptorium sounds quiet, almost peaceful, a room of men bent over desks making careful marks on parchment. In reality it was serious, demanding work. Copying a single book could take months. Mistakes had consequences. The preparation of the parchment itself, made from stretched, dried, scraped animal skin, required skilled craft before a single letter was written. And the illuminated manuscripts that came out of this tradition, those extraordinary decorated books with painted borders and intricate initial letters, required skills that would be described today as fine art, graphic design, and precision draftsmanship combined. All performed without electricity, in natural light, with tools made from feathers. The Book of Kells, produced by Irish monks around the 9th century, is considered one of the most beautiful objects ever made by human hands. It is also, technically, a copy of the 4 Gospels. Its creators were doing a preservation job. They just happened to turn that job into a masterpiece. which is the kind of thing that happens when you give serious people a serious task and enough time to do it properly. The libraries that survived this period weren't lucky accidents. They were the result of deliberate, sustained human effort across generations of people who understood that knowledge, once lost, does not automatically return. Every manuscript that survived into the modern world passed through the hands of someone who chose to copy it, protect it, and pass it on. That choice, made in cold rooms by people whose names we mostly don't know, is the reason you can read Aristotle today. It deserves to be called what it was: civilization, actively maintaining itself against the forces that would have ended it. If someone told you that universities were invented in the Middle Ages, you might assume they were talking about something rudimentary, a few monks in a barn perhaps, doing irregular lessons on rainy afternoons, with a curriculum that was mostly memorizing Bible verses and avoiding drafts. You would be wrong. Medieval universities were large, organized, contentious, politically complicated institutions with thousands of students, formal degree programs, professional faculties, and the kind of internal arguments about curriculum that would feel entirely familiar to any modern academic who has ever sat through a departmental meeting. The University of Bologna, founded in 1088, is generally considered the oldest university in the Western world still in continuous operation. It was established to study law, specifically Roman law, which was experiencing a revival as people tried to make sense of the increasingly complex legal needs of a growing mercantile society. Students came from across Europe to Bologna, paying scholars for instruction, eventually organising themselves into guilds to negotiate better rates and living conditions. This was, in its way, a student union, just with more Latin and fewer printed flyers. The students at Bologna were paying customers with real leverage, and they used it. At various points they fined professors for arriving late to lectures or for failing to cover the promised material. Medieval students were not passive recipients of wisdom. They were difficult, demanding, and apparently very serious about getting what they paid for. Paris followed not long after, and Oxford after that. By the 13th century, there were universities in Cambridge, Salamanca, Naples, Padua, and dozens of other cities. These were not small affairs. The University of Paris at its height may have had as many as 10,000 students, a figure that would make it a mid-sized modern institution. They studied theology, philosophy, medicine, law, and what was called the liberal arts: grammar, rhetoric, logic, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. This was a rigorous curriculum designed to produce people who could think, argue, and analyse, not merely recite. The goal was the formation of a particular kind of mind, one that could encounter a problem, marshal relevant knowledge, construct an argument, and defend it against objection. Not a bad goal. Several modern universities are still nominally attempting it. The medieval university also generated something that would shape Western intellectual life profoundly: scholasticism. Scholasticism was a method of intellectual inquiry that involved taking difficult questions, philosophical, theological, scientific, and systematically working through them by examining multiple authorities, identifying contradictions, and attempting to reconcile them through reasoned argument. It sounds dry when described that way. In practice, it was intellectual combat, conducted in public, often in front of large audiences who came specifically to watch scholars argue. Formal disputations, structured debates in which a master would defend a position against all challengers, were a central part of university life, and the best practitioners were medieval celebrities of a specific, niche kind. If you want to understand how exciting a medieval disputation could be, imagine the most heated academic argument you've ever witnessed. Then add Latin, several hundred students, and actual professional stakes, and you're getting somewhere. Thomas Aquinas, one of the most famous medieval scholars, wrote the Summa Theologica in the 13th century, a systematic attempt to reconcile Aristotelian philosophy with Christian theology. It runs to several million words. It proceeds by presenting objections to each position, then answering each objection in turn, then drawing conclusions, a method that is recognisably the same method that lawyers, scientists and philosophers use today. Whatever one thinks of its conclusions, the sheer ambition of the project, the rigour of its method, and the clarity of its organisational logic are not the products of a dark and ignorant age. They are the products of someone who had read everything available to him, thought about it deeply for decades, and then wrote it all down in organised, accessible Latin so that other people could engage with it. That is an enormous amount of homework. It is also, recognisably, scholarship, the same activity that universities exist to produce, then and now. Here is something the phrase Dark Ages quietly obscures. While parts of Western Europe were experiencing genuine political fragmentation and reduced complexity, a civilization was flourishing elsewhere that was, by almost any measure, the most scientifically and intellectually advanced in the world. The Islamic Golden Age, which ran roughly from the 8th through the 13th centuries, produced achievements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, chemistry and optics that would not be equalled in Europe for centuries. Calling the period dark while this was happening is a bit like standing in a room with one window and several working light fixtures and complaining about the lack of illumination because your corner is dim. And this wasn't happening in some isolated corner of the world that could conveniently be ignored. It was happening in Baghdad, in Cairo, in Cordoba, cities that were, at the time, among the largest and most sophisticated on earth. Baghdad, under the Abbasid Caliphate, was a planned city of extraordinary scale, home to the House of Wisdom, an institution that functioned simultaneously as a library, translation centre, and research academy. Scholars working there translated Greek philosophical and scientific texts into Arabic, preserving and extending knowledge from the classical world. They didn't just copy what the Greeks had done. They argued with it, corrected it, and built on it in ways that took human understanding considerably further than it had been when they started. Al-Khwarizmi, working in Baghdad in the 9th century, wrote the foundational text of algebra. The word algebra comes from the title of his book, Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, which translates roughly as the compendious book on calculation by completion and balancing, which is either a very confident title or a very accurate description of the field, depending on how you feel about mathematics. The word algorithm comes from a Latinization of his name. He is, in a very real sense, one of the reasons your phone works. This is a man from the 9th century whose intellectual contributions are embedded in the infrastructure of 21st century daily life. That is not a footnote. That is a significant portion of the chapter. Elsewhere in the Islamic world, Ibn al-Haytham was laying the groundwork for the science of optics in the 11th century, describing how vision works, how light behaves, and how the eye processes images, all through systematic experimentation conducted 7 centuries before the European scientific revolution claimed the experimental method as its own innovation. Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna, wrote the Canon of Medicine, an encyclopedic medical text that was used as a teaching document in European universities well into the 17th century. The man died in 1037. His textbook was required reading for medical students 500 years after his death. If your work is still the curriculum half a millennium after you're gone, you are probably doing something right. In Cordoba, the capital of Moorish Spain, the library reportedly held hundreds of thousands of volumes at a time when most Western European royal libraries held a few hundred. The city had paved, lit streets, public baths, and sophisticated sewage infrastructure, amenities that would not be common in most European cities for several more centuries. It was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the world, where Muslim, Jewish, and Christian scholars worked in proximity and sometimes in direct collaboration, translating, debating, and extending each other's ideas. This was not a golden age happening in a sealed room with no effect on the outside world. The scholarship produced in Cordoba, Baghdad, and Cairo flowed back into European intellectual life through translation movements in Spain and Sicily, and formed a substantial part of the foundation on which European universities built their curricula. None of this fits the narrative of a world sunk in darkness. What it describes is a world in which learning and sophistication were flourishing, just not primarily in the corner of that world that the people who coined the phrase Dark Ages happened to be standing in. The darkness was always partially a map problem. If you drew the map with Western Europe at the centre, and everything else as peripheral, you could look at the 5th through 10th centuries and see a contraction in one region. If you drew the map with the whole world on it, which is the correct map, you would see a considerably more interesting picture. Yes, there were leeches. Let's get that out of the way immediately. Medieval medicine used leeches, and the theory behind why they were used, the idea that illness resulted from imbalances in bodily fluids called humours, was wrong in ways that occasionally got people killed. No one is going to pretend that a barber surgeon pulling your tooth out by candlelight without anaesthesia was an ideal healthcare experience. It was not. By modern standards, a substantial portion of medieval medical practice was ineffective, and some of it was actively harmful. This should be acknowledged clearly and without defensiveness. But medieval medicine was not simply superstition dressed in Latin. It was a systematic attempt to understand the human body based on the best available knowledge, and within the limits of that knowledge, medieval physicians did things that were surprisingly effective, and occasionally things that were centuries ahead of being understood correctly. The history of medicine is not a clean line from ignorance to knowledge. It is a complicated accumulation, full of wrong turns and accidental right ones, and the medieval period contributed to both categories in ways that deserve closer examination than the leech jokes usually allow. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century German abbess, and one of the most remarkable figures of the entire medieval period, wrote extensively about medicine and natural history in works called the Physica and Causae et Curae. Her writing described hundreds of plants, animals and minerals and their therapeutic uses. Some of her recommendations were based on sound observation. She wrote about the importance of diet and moderate exercise for maintaining health, about the relationship between mental states and physical well-being, and about the specific properties of individual plants, with a precision that suggests genuine attention to outcomes rather than inherited theory alone. She was also a composer, a theologian, a mystic, and a correspondent with emperors and popes, which suggests an organisational capacity that even modern people might find aspirational. Medieval practitioners also had access to a tradition of herbal medicine that, in many cases, had genuine therapeutic value that modern science has subsequently confirmed. Willow bark, which contains saliene, the compound from which aspirin is derived, was used to reduce fever and pain. Honey was applied to wounds as an antiseptic, and while medieval practitioners didn't know the biochemical mechanisms, honey does have genuine antibacterial properties that make it a reasonable wound dressing. The use of mould from bread on infected wounds, documented in several medieval sources, preceded the deliberate development of penicillin by hundreds of years. People were noticing that something in the mould was helping. They couldn't explain why, but noticing and applying an effective treatment, even without the correct explanation, is better than not noticing. The medical schools of Salerno in southern Italy, functioning from as early as the 9th century and drawing on classical Greek, Arabic, and local empirical traditions simultaneously, trained physicians using a curriculum that was genuinely concerned with outcomes. Students at Salerno studied anatomy, pharmacy, and surgical technique. The Trotula, a collection of medical texts associated with Salerno that addressed women's health, described conditions and treatments with a specificity that reflects clinical observation. Women's health was not considered beneath medical attention at Salerno, which puts the institution ahead of certain later periods that are not labelled dark. Medieval medicine was flawed, often dramatically so. But it wasn't ignorance masquerading as expertise. It was incomplete knowledge applied with varying degrees of skill by people who, in many cases, genuinely wanted to help, and who were working from the best intellectual frameworks available to them. Which is, if you think about it carefully, not entirely unlike medicine in any era. Medicine is always catching up to what the body's actually doing. The medieval gap was larger than ours, but the direction of travel, toward observation, toward systematization, toward the genuine desire to understand, was the same direction that all medical progress has moved in before and since. Stand at the base of Chartres Cathedral and look up. The building was begun in 1194. There were no computers, no structural analysis software, no steel reinforcement, no power tools, no standardized building materials, and no way to model how forces would travel through stone before you actually built the thing and found out whether it stayed up. And yet Chartres is still standing. It has been standing for over 800 years, through wars, revolutions, lightning strikes, and one extremely close call during the Second World War. It will almost certainly still be standing when everyone currently alive is gone. Whatever the people who built it were doing, they were doing it correctly. Medieval Gothic architecture is one of the most extraordinary achievements in the history of human construction, and it was invented, developed, and refined entirely within the period that historians used to call the Dark Ages. The technical problem Gothic architects were trying to solve was simple in principle, and extraordinarily difficult in execution. How do you build a stone building that is very tall, has very large windows, lets in a great deal of light, and doesn't collapse? Stone is heavy. The more stone you stack, the more the walls below must support. Traditional Romanesque buildings solved this problem by making the walls very thick, which works, but produces dark, heavy interiors lit by small windows. Gothic architects wanted something different. They wanted height and light and elegance, the three things that thick Romanesque walls make most difficult to achieve simultaneously. The solution they developed was an engineering system of remarkable sophistication, invented not in a laboratory but through accumulated practical experience, passed down through guild apprenticeships and refined through the analysis of what had failed. The pointed arch distributes weight more efficiently than a round one, pushing it downward rather than outward. The ribbed vault concentrates the weight of the ceiling onto specific points, rather than spreading it evenly across the walls, and most ingeniously, the flying buttress transfers the outward thrust of the heavy stone roof away from the walls entirely, and down into separate external supports that stand at a distance from the building like mechanical legs. This meant the walls no longer needed to be the primary load-bearing elements, which meant the walls could be thin, which meant the walls could contain enormous windows, which meant the interior of a Gothic cathedral could be flooded with light, with coloured light, if the windows were filled with stained glass, in a way that was not accidental but deliberately, carefully engineered, to produce a specific emotional and spiritual effect on the people standing inside. The people who built these buildings did not have engineering degrees. They had apprenticeships, accumulated guild knowledge, and an empirical understanding of structural behaviour developed through generations of practice and occasional catastrophic failure. Some Gothic buildings did collapse, and those collapses were studied carefully and the lessons incorporated into future designs in ways that gradually improved the reliability of the method. One of the nave vaults at Beauvais Cathedral fell down in the 13th century after the builders pushed the height further than the structural system could bear at its current level of development. They rebuilt it, modified the design, and the building still stands today, the tallest Gothic vault in existence. That is not darkness. That is engineering, the iterative, empirical process of pushing a system until it fails, learning from the failure and building something better. The cathedrals took decades or centuries to build. The people who laid the first stones knew they would not live to see the finished building. Their children might not either, or their children's children. They built anyway, for a community that would not exist for generations, in service of a vision that would be completed by strangers. That is a form of ambition and collective purpose and faith in the future that deserves more than the label dark. It deserves, at minimum, the word that visitors involuntarily say when they walk through the doors and see the light coming through the windows of Chartres for the first time, a word that requires no translation and that the architects of 800 years ago were specifically designing to provoke. Here is something nobody tells you about the Middle Ages. They were funny. Not accidentally funny. Not funny in the way that old things seem funny, because they're quaint and use outdated vocabulary. Actually funny, with jokes that are recognisable as jokes, and humour that is recognisably human and often startlingly familiar. Medieval people laughed at pompous authority. They made dirty jokes. They drew absurd pictures when they were supposed to be doing something serious. They wrote stories specifically designed to make audiences howl. If you went back in time and sat in a medieval tavern, and someone told you one of Chaucer's funnier tales, you would laugh. This is underreported. Medieval manuscripts are full of marginalia, the little drawings and notes that scribes drew in the margins of serious religious and administrative documents. Monks who spent their days carefully copying sacred texts apparently could not resist, on occasion, drawing a knight fighting a snail in the margin beside a passage about spiritual fortitude, or a rabbit hunting a man with a bow and arrow, or a monkey conducting a church service apparently with more authority than the actual clergy, or a dog playing a musical instrument with suspicious competence. These images appear in manuscripts across Europe, and they are clearly jokes, deliberate, playful departures from the serious work the scribe was supposed to be doing. They are the medieval equivalent of a doodle in the margin of your notebook, except they have survived for 700 years, which is considerably better than most doodles manage. Nobody knows with certainty what all of them mean, but their tonal register is unmistakable. Someone drew a snail defeating a knight, and other people saw it and appreciated it, and nobody threw the manuscript away. That is a workplace culture that contains humour. The fabliaux were short comic tales popular in France from the 12th century onward, and they were not gentle. They were often bawdy, satirical and pointed, stories about foolish husbands who get comprehensively outsmarted by their wives. corrupt clergy whose piety extends only as far as their personal comfort, merchants undone by their own greed, and the general human tendency to believe one is smarter than one actually is. The humour is earthy, direct, and sometimes startlingly crude by the standards of what we imagine medieval people were writing. Nobody was exempt. Peasants, nobles, priests, merchants, the fablio found everyone equally ridiculous, which is the only truly democratic form of comedy. Reading them, you get the clear sense that medieval people were not living in grim theological terror every waking moment. They were also telling each other stories specifically designed to produce laughter at human pretension, which is extremely human of them and also excellent judgment. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the late 14th century, is one of the funniest books in the English language. It contains fart jokes so elaborate they have been analysed at academic conferences. The Miller's Tale features a man who brands another man on the buttocks with a hot iron in the middle of a dispute about flatulence that has already gone extremely wrong for everyone involved, and the whole thing is written with a timing and escalation that any modern comedy writer would respect. This is not a dark and joyless document. It is a celebration of human absurdity, written by someone who found people endlessly entertaining and had an audience that clearly agreed with him. Chaucer's tales were popular. People copied them, passed them around, read them aloud. They laughed at them. An audience capable of appreciating that level of comic craft is not an audience sunk in misery and superstition. It is an audience very much alive. Medieval carnival traditions tell us something similar. Many European cities held annual periods of sanctioned social inversion, festivals in which normal hierarchies were temporarily upended, where people dressed as clergy and enacted mock sermons, where the usual social rules were loosened for a few days of collective permission to be ridiculous. These were not quiet affairs. They were loud, physical, participatory, and clearly looked forward to by the people who attended them. The appetite for fun that these festivals reveal is not a medieval anomaly. It is a consistent feature of every human society that has ever existed. People need to laugh. They found ways to do it in the Middle Ages, just as they have in every other period, and the evidence that they succeeded is the fact that the laughter is still audible in the documents they left behind. When you picture medieval commerce, you might picture a small village market with local farmers selling root vegetables to each other, and the occasional cart of cheese of ambiguous quality, a man with a pig, a woman with some onions, everyone negotiating in the same dialect about the same turnips they have been negotiating about for decades. This picture is not entirely wrong for the most local and rural levels of medieval economic life, but it is extraordinarily incomplete, and what it leaves out changes the picture dramatically. Medieval Europe was embedded in trade networks that spanned continents, and the goods moving through those networks touched daily life in ways that are easy to underestimate because the supply chains that produced them were so successfully invisible at the point of consumption. The spices that medieval cooks used, the ones that appear constantly in historical accounts as extraordinarily expensive luxury goods, the ones that drove centuries of exploration and shaped the development of capitalism, were coming from Southeast Asia and India, travelling thousands of miles through multiple intermediaries across land and sea routes that crossed a dozen different political and cultural zones before reaching a kitchen in England or France or the German states. That supply chain was complicated, risky, and sustained by the coordinated work of traders, shippers, bankers, translators, and warehousemen across an enormous geographic area. It was not a small operation. It was an international system, and it was functioning continuously throughout the supposedly dark centuries. The Hanseatic League was a commercial and defensive confederation of merchant guilds and market towns in northern Europe that, at its height, dominated trade across the North Sea and Baltic regions for several centuries. It was not a state. It had no king, no single capital, no standing army. It was a network of commercial cities that had decided their interests were better served by cooperation than competition, and it negotiated trade agreements with foreign rulers, maintained its own legal system, enforced quality standards on goods, and effectively functioned as a commercial empire without bothering to crown anyone. Member cities included Hamburg, Lübeck, Bruges, and dozens of others. The League moved wool, grain, timber, furs, herring, and cloth across distances that required months of travel. It maintained warehouses called contours in foreign cities, in London, in Bruges, in Novgorod, permanent commercial establishments operating under negotiated legal protections. This was sophisticated international commerce, and it was medieval. Medieval banking was also considerably more sophisticated than the phrase medieval banking might suggest. Italian banking families, the Medici being the most famous, but preceded and accompanied by the Bardi, the Peruzzi, the Strozzi, and many others, developed instruments of credit, letters of exchange, and double-entry bookkeeping that were genuine financial innovations. The ability to transfer money across Europe without physically moving coins, through letters of credit honoured at correspondent banks in different cities, was a major development that both facilitated commerce and reduced the very real risk of robbery on roads that were not uniformly safe. Medieval bankers were inventing financial instruments that would directly shape the development of capitalism for centuries. The next time you use a bank transfer, you're using a medieval invention. This is not Dark Age finance. This is the origin of modern finance developed by people in the medieval period who needed it and built it from scratch. The standard image of a medieval woman's life goes roughly like this: born, married young, had children, died in childbirth, was largely absent from history except as a name in a marriage record or a cause of a dynastic dispute. This image is not entirely fabricated. The structural conditions of medieval life were genuinely difficult for women, legal disabilities were real, and the historical record disproportionately preserved the lives and words of men because the men doing the recording found male lives more interesting than female ones, which tells us more about the recorders than the recorded. But the image leaves out an enormous amount, and what it leaves out is remarkable enough to fundamentally alter the picture. Hildegard of Bingen, already mentioned in the context of medicine and natural philosophy, is worth returning to as an example of how wrong the invisible woman narrative can be. She was the abbess of a convent she had founded herself, after negotiating with her previous abbot for the right to establish an independent house. She was a composer whose music is still performed and recorded today. She left a body of sacred vocal music that is extraordinary in both quantity and quality, and it was entirely her own work, not transcribed from someone else's composition. She was a writer on theology, cosmology, and natural science. She was a correspondent with popes, emperors, and abbots across Europe, and her letters are not deferential. They are direct, sometimes demanding, occasionally critical of powerful men in terms that would have been remarkable from anyone. She was a preacher at a time when women were not supposed to preach publicly, and when religious authorities questioned her mandate, she argued that her visions, which had been officially certified as genuine by the relevant church authorities, gave her a specific divine instruction that superseded normal restrictions. They largely accepted this reasoning, possibly because she was obviously extraordinary, and partly because arguing with her was reportedly very difficult. She was 81 years old when she died. In the 12th century, that is a statistical improbability. She managed it through what one can only assume was sheer refusal to be inconvenient. Christine de Pizan, writing in France at the turn of the 15th century, was possibly the first woman in European history to support herself financially through writing. She was widowed young with children, which left her in a situation that should, by the standard narrative, have resulted in rapid poverty and obscurity. Instead, she wrote poetry, political allegory, history, biography, and in her most famous work, The Book of the City of Ladies, a systematic argument against misogynist attitudes that drew on historical examples of women's virtue and capability. She was arguing clearly and in writing against the cultural dismissal of women in the medieval period, with an intellectual seriousness that continues to be recognised by scholars today. She had a readership. People paid for copies of her work. She supported her family on the income. That is an accomplished medieval woman having a career in the 14th century, and she was not alone in doing remarkable things, only among the most documented. Women ran households that were, in many cases, genuine economic enterprises, requiring sustained managerial skill. In the absence of their husbands, away at war, on pilgrimage, or simply dead, all common medieval scenarios, women managed estates, conducted legal business, corresponded with tenants and creditors, and made financial decisions that shaped family fortunes across generations. The letters of medieval noblewomen and merchants' wives show confident economic actors, not passive domestics. Brewers in medieval England were predominantly women, alewives who produced and sold the drink that functioned as the primary safe alternative to contaminated water for most of the population. The medieval economy would have been considerably less functional without them. These were not women waiting to be noticed by history. They were doing things that mattered, and the record, when you look at it carefully enough, contains them. The Black Death killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351. That number is so large it is almost impossible to hold in the mind as a human reality rather than a statistic. Villages emptied overnight. Families lost every member in the span of weeks. Priests who administered last rites died of the same illness before they could be given last rites themselves. Cities that had been growing for generations contracted in months. The psychological toll on survivors was enormous. They were living in a world that had suddenly, incomprehensibly, become half empty, full of abandoned houses and untended fields, and the specific grief of loss too large to process in any normal way. This is not the uplifting part of the story, and there is no way to make it uplifting without being dishonest. The uplifting part, and there genuinely is one, in a complicated and hard-won way, is what happened next. The aftermath of the Black Death was not simply continued decline and misery stretching forward without change. It was, in several important respects, transformation. And transformation, even when it emerges from catastrophe, is not the same as darkness. It is evidence of a society that has been struck and has not stopped moving. Labour became scarce in ways that rearranged the social order from the ground up. Suddenly, peasants who had previously been bound to the land under serfdom, legally obligated to remain on estates they didn't own, providing labour to lords who held coercive power over their movements and options, found themselves in a dramatically improved bargaining position, simply because half the people who might have competed with them for those positions were dead. Lords who had lost substantial portions of their workforce needed workers more than those workers needed any particular lord. Wages rose. Serfs began to demand and receive better conditions. In England, the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 was in many ways the late consequence of social changes set in motion by the demographic catastrophe 30 years earlier. People who had experienced better conditions and refused to return to worse ones when lords attempted to restore pre-plague arrangements. The feudal system did not collapse overnight, but the plague years cracked its foundations in ways that were irreversible. People responded to the plague with acts of community care that are not what you would expect from a society characterized by ignorance and superstition. In some cities, people organized to bury the dead at genuine risk to themselves, because the dead needed burying and someone had to do it. Charitable institutions worked beyond capacity. Communities that had survived the worst of the outbreak sent help to those still struggling. These are not the actions of a society that has been reduced to animal survival instinct. They are the actions of people who understood themselves to have obligations to each other and who honoured those obligations under conditions of extreme difficulty. Boccaccio wrote the Decameron during and in the immediate aftermath of the plague years, a collection of 100 stories told by a group of young Florentines sheltering in a country villa while the epidemic ravages their city. The stories are frequently funny, often bawdy, and deeply, insistently alive. Boccaccio's response to witnessing mass death was to write about human pleasure, wit, ingenuity, desire, and the comic absurdity of pretension, with enormous vitality and evident delight. He did not write despair. He wrote the celebration of life in the presence of its ending, which is one of the most specifically and recognizably human responses to mortality that exists. That is not a dark response. That is the response of someone who understood exactly what was at stake and chose, deliberately, to be on the side of the living. Medieval art has a reputation problem. The standard critique goes something like this. Medieval figures look flat, stiff, and disproportionate. Compare them to Renaissance paintings with their lifelike human figures, a mathematically precise perspective, and the medieval work looks like it was done by someone who had never seen a person standing in natural light. The faces are stylized. The bodies don't quite behave the way bodies behave. Nobody casts a shadow. Conclusion. Medieval art was primitive, a holding pattern between the classical world and the Renaissance, something to be appreciated charitably and moved past quickly on the way to the good stuff. This conclusion makes a fundamental category error, and once you see the error, you can't unsee it. It judges medieval art by standards that medieval art was not trying to meet. Renaissance painting was trying to create the illusion of three-dimensional space on a two-dimensional surface that is its explicit goal, and it achieves that goal with extraordinary skill. But that was not the goal of most medieval art. Medieval religious art was trying to do something else entirely, something that required different choices, not failed attempts at the same choices the Renaissance would make later. When judged by its own aims, medieval art was doing what it intended with remarkable precision, and the sophistication of those intentions is easy to underestimate if you've only ever looked at the results through a Renaissance lens. Byzantine icons, for instance, are not trying to look like photographs. They are trying to create objects through which the viewer can encounter the divine, windows in the other direction, outward toward the sacred rather than inward toward the convincing illusion of physical space. The stylization, the gold backgrounds that eliminate any sense of earthly location, the large eyes and compressed figures, these are deliberate aesthetic choices made by highly trained artists working in a sophisticated tradition that had thought carefully over centuries about what sacred art was for and how to achieve it. The gold background is not a failure to paint a sky. It is a statement that this scene is not happening in the world where skies exist. That is a theological position expressed through visual choice, and making it well requires both technical skill and intellectual clarity about what you are doing and why. Byzantine mosaic work takes the argument further still, covering entire walls and ceilings of churches with compositions of extraordinary scale and complexity, worked in tiny pieces of glass and stone set at carefully calculated angles to reflect light in specific directions. These were made by skilled craftspeople working to precise designs with materials that required specialized knowledge to produce and place. The mosaics of Ravenna, the churches of San Vitale and Sant'Apollinare, produced in the 6th century, are among the most beautiful things made by human hands in any period. They are not transitional, they are not primitive. They are the full realization of a visual tradition at the height of its powers, and people travel from across the world to stand in front of them today, not out of historical obligation, but because they are genuinely stunning. Illuminated manuscripts add another dimension. The miniaturized painted scenes in medieval books, produced with tiny brushes, without magnification, by natural light, on surfaces that required elaborate preparation, demand skills that most professional illustrators today would respect without reservation. The colours used were often made from extraordinarily expensive materials. Lapis lazuli ground from stone imported from Afghanistan for blue, gold leaf applied over carefully prepared surfaces, vermilion and verdigris and lead white prepared through laborious chemical processes. The people making these objects were not amateur decorators filling time between prayers. They were specialists, working in a tradition they had spent years mastering, producing objects that were understood by their makers and their audiences as serious works of visual art. The fact that their goals differed from Renaissance goals does not make them lesser. It makes them different, which is a distinction that anyone who has ever been told their work doesn't count, because it doesn't look like someone else's work should find immediately recognizable. Medieval cuisine has a reputation roughly equivalent to medieval medicine, something done badly by people who didn't know better, involving mostly grey porridge, mystery stews of debatable content, and the occasional desperate root vegetable boiled until it had surrendered all memory of having been a plant. This picture is accurate for the genuinely poor in genuinely bad years, and those years existed, and the hunger was real, and none of that should be minimized. Famine was a recurring feature of medieval life, and the people who experienced it suffered in ways that deserve acknowledgement rather than comic treatment. But medieval cuisine at its better-off levels, which included not just the nobility but prosperous merchants, skilled craftspeople, and urban workers in good years, was considerably more interesting, more varied, and more deliberately pleasurable than the grey porridge narrative allows. Medieval cookbooks survive. This is a fact that tends to surprise people who have absorbed the idea that medieval people ate whatever was available without any particular thought about how to make it good. The books exist, we can read them, and they describe a cuisine that was highly spiced, carefully prepared, and deeply interested in the relationship between flavour, texture, presentation, and the health effects of different foods on different constitutions. The form of cury, compiled by the master cooks of King Richard II of England in the late 14th century, contains nearly 200 recipes covering everything from roasted meats to elaborate sweet dishes, sauces, pastries, and complex preparations involving multiple spices and careful technique. It is not a document that suggests people were indifferent to food. It is a document that suggests people were paying very close attention. Medieval cooks use spices with confidence and ambition that can seem almost aggressive by modern standards. The spice trade that made pepper worth its weight in silver also made those spices available to people who could afford them, and medieval recipes for festive dishes frequently call for multiple spices combined in ways that were clearly intentional and carefully considered. Ginger, cinnamon, cardamom, saffron, pepper, cloves, mace, nutmeg. Medieval cooks were working with a flavour palette that was, if anything, more internationally sourced than much of modern home cooking. The prevailing theory among food historians is that medieval spicing was not designed to mask the taste of rotten meat, a myth that has been thoroughly debunked, but rather to demonstrate wealth, to please sophisticated palates that had developed an appetite for complex flavours, and to align with medical theories about the health benefits of particular spice combinations. People used expensive spices because they liked them and could afford them, which is the same reason expensive ingredients appear in cooking in any era. Medieval feasting culture understood food as theatre as much as nourishment. Great lords employed cooks whose job included not just making things that tasted good, but making things that looked extraordinary. Dishes formed into the shapes of castles or heraldic animals. Pies that, when opened, released live birds in a moment of carefully engineered surprise. Elaborate jellies in multiple colours layered to create visual effects. Sugar sculptures of improbable ambition placed at the centre of tables as edible architecture. These were performances as much as meals, designed to impress, to signal wealth and sophistication, and to create an experience of abundance that guests would remember and recount to people who hadn't been there. The medieval feast was an event with production values, not a functional fueling stop. The fact that the production values included different technologies than modern catering uses does not make them less deliberate or less achieved. Even the humbler end of medieval eating had more variety and nutritional intelligence than the porridge narrative suggests. Medieval peasant cooking made use of pulse-based dishes, pea and bean soups and stews, that provided genuine protein. Preserved fish, particularly herring from the North Sea, was a dietary staple across much of northern Europe, and provided nutrition that grain alone could not. Seasonal vegetables, dairy products in their various forms, foraged herbs and fruits. The medieval diet at its ordinary level was nutritionally limited by modern standards, but more varied and more carefully managed than the historical shorthand gives it credit for. People knew that different foods had different properties. They cooked with that knowledge. They took pleasure in eating when eating was good. That is not a Dark Age attitude toward food. That is the entirely human experience of being hungry, satisfied, and grateful that the meal was worth having. If you heard medieval music on the street today, you would recognize it as music. This seems obvious, but it is worth stating clearly because the mental image of medieval sound that many people carry is vaguely primitive, something droning, unstructured, more noise than music, the sonic equivalent of the flat artistic style or the grey porridge. This image is wrong in every direction. Medieval music is structured, melodic, emotionally resonant, rhythmically organised, and deeply human in its expressive range. It covered everything from sacred solemnity to bawdy comedy, from the intimate to the monumental, and it was everywhere, in churches, in courts, in taverns, in fields at harvest time, at weddings, at funerals, at festivals, in the streets during carnival. Medieval people were not living in silence between prayers. They were surrounded by music constantly, producing it and consuming it in ways that were central to how they understood their social and spiritual lives. Gregorian chant, the most famous form of medieval sacred music, is both simpler and stranger than most modern music, a single melodic line, unaccompanied by harmony, following the rhythm of the Latin text rather than a fixed metric pattern. It sounds, to modern ears, like something from another dimension, which is partly the point. Heard in a stone church with the long natural reverberations that Gothic architecture produces, it is one of the most distinctive and arresting sounds available to human experience. And it was designed for those acoustics. The composers and singers who developed the chant tradition were working in dialogue with their sonic environment, understanding that the building itself was part of the instrument. The music and the architecture were in conversation with each other across centuries, each shaping how the other was made and experienced. That is not primitive music. That is site-specific acoustic composition, and it still works exactly as intended in the buildings it was made for. But Gregorian chant was only one element of a far richer musical world. By the 12th and 13th centuries, polyphony, music written for multiple simultaneous voices singing different melodic lines, had developed in ways that were genuinely complex and technically ambitious. The Notre Dame School of Composition, associated with composers Léonin and Perrotin, working in Paris in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, produced multi-voice sacred music of considerable sophistication. Perrotin's Videron Omne, written for 4 independent voices, creates sonic textures of remarkable density and beauty that can still produce a physical response in a modern listener who encounters it unexpectedly. This was not folk music or amateur devotion. It was professional composition at a high level, produced by trained musicians working in a tradition with its own theory, its own notation system, and its own aesthetic criteria about what constituted good work. The troubadours of southern France and the trouvères of northern France composed secular songs in the vernacular languages about love, nature, politics, and the general comedy of human experience. These were professional poets and musicians who travelled between courts, performing original compositions for paying audiences who had specific expectations and sophisticated enough taste to reward quality over mediocrity. The songs themselves range from delicate and formally refined to satirical and frankly crude, covering the full emotional spectrum with a completeness that suggests their audiences were not emotionally simple people seeking simple satisfactions. Love poetry written in the troubadour tradition is capable of genuine subtlety, distinguishing between kinds of longing, analysing the phenomenology of desire with a precision that is not what you would expect from people supposedly too ground down by Dark Age existence to notice their own inner lives. They noticed. They wrote about it. They set it to music. Other people paid to hear it. Medieval music theory was also more developed than its popular reputation suggests. Guido of Arezzo, an 11th century monk, developed a system of musical notation and a method of teaching singers to read music at sight that was a genuine pedagogical revolution. The do re mi solfege system that you learned, or were at least exposed to in school, the one that appears in the sound of music as if it were simply common sense, is a medieval invention, developed by a medieval monk trying to solve the practical problem of teaching people to sing music they had never heard before. You use a medieval Italian monk's pedagogical system every time you hum a scale. The Middle Ages are in your music whether you know it or not. Medieval natural philosophy, what we would now call science, was not identical to modern science. The experimental method as a systematic and deliberate practice, the concept of controlled trials with careful variable management, the insistence on falsifiability as the criterion of a genuine scientific claim, these were developed and formalized in later centuries in ways that represent real intellectual progress. But the idea that medieval people looked at the natural world and saw only religious symbol, with no curiosity about actual mechanisms and no interest in how things actually worked, is wrong in ways that the historical record makes embarrassingly clear. Medieval people looked at the natural world with genuine curiosity, made careful observations, argued about what those observations meant, and in several cases reached conclusions that turned out to be correct, well before they had any theoretical framework to explain why. Hildegard of Bingen's natural philosophy, already mentioned in the medical context, extended well beyond plants and their therapeutic uses. She described the structure of the cosmos, the behaviour of weather, the properties of stones and animals, and the relationships between the human body and the natural world with a systematic attention to detail that reflects genuine inquiry rather than inherited assertion alone. She distinguished between what she had observed and what she was reasoning from observation too, a distinction that is, in its basic form, the distinction that underlies scientific method. She was also wrong about many things, but being wrong while making careful observations and attempting to reason systematically from them is a fundamentally different intellectual activity from not looking at all. Albert the Great, a 13th century German scholar whose breadth of learning earned him the nickname Doctor Universalis, which is the medieval equivalent of a compliment that is also slightly alarming, wrote extensively on animals, plants and minerals with an explicitly empirical orientation. In his biological writings, he distinguished repeatedly between what ancient authorities had claimed and what he himself had directly observed, and he was explicit that observation should correct received authority when the two disagreed. This is not a medieval intellectual deferring to tradition. This is a medieval intellectual explicitly prioritizing observation over tradition and explaining why. That is a proto-scientific position, stated clearly in the 13th century, and it deserves to be recognised as such rather than buried in the general assumption that medieval people couldn't think their way to empirical conclusions. Roger Bacon, a 13th century English friar who managed to spend a substantial portion of his life under some form of ecclesiastical suspicion for being intellectually inconvenient, wrote about the importance of experimentation as a method for acquiring reliable knowledge of the natural world and described optical experiments he had conducted with lenses and light. He also wrote with striking foresight about the possibility of machines that could fly, of vehicles that moved without horses, of devices that could magnify distant objects, not as fantasy but as logical extensions of principles he understood to be real. Whether or not these speculations were well-founded in every detail, the habit of mind they represent, looking at principles and reasoning toward their consequences, including consequences that do not yet exist, is the habit of mind that produces scientific and technological development. Bacon had it. He was doing it in the 13th century. He was doing it in a friar's habit with a quill, which is less efficient than a laptop but not fundamentally different in intellectual character. Medieval astronomy accumulated centuries of careful observational data about the positions and movements of celestial bodies that would have been impossible to collect any other way than by doing it, night after night, year after year, with patience and precision. The astronomical knowledge that Arabic and European scholars built up during the medieval period, refined measurements of the solar year, improved methods for calculating planetary positions, more accurate star catalogues, was the direct empirical foundation on which Copernicus, Brahe and Kepler would later build their revolutionary conclusions. They were not starting from ignorance. They were starting from centuries of medieval work, and they knew it. Copernicus cited medieval Islamic astronomers. Kepler depended on Brahe's observations, which depended on an entire tradition of medieval astronomical practice. The scientific revolution was not a beginning. It was a development of medieval curiosity, medieval method, and medieval data. There is a version of medieval history in which Europe is isolated, turned inward, cut off from the wider world, huddled in its local villages producing local goods for local consumption, and knowing essentially nothing about anything beyond the next valley. This version is wrong in ways that become obvious almost immediately if you look at the material evidence sitting in medieval buildings, medieval kitchens, and medieval graves across the continent. The cloth on a medieval noble's back came from Flanders or Italy or further east. The spices in a medieval cook's pantry came from India and Southeast Asia. The coins in a medieval merchant's pouch might have circulated through half a dozen economies before reaching him. Medieval Europe was entangled with the world in ways that its popular reputation almost completely fails to convey. The Silk Road didn't pause for the medieval period. It kept going, a network of overland and maritime routes connecting China and East Asia to Central Asia, the Islamic world, the Mediterranean, and from there into European markets. Goods from China, silk, which gave the routes their name, but also porcelain, paper, and a range of luxury items, moved westward through multiple stages of trade, changing hands and prices as they went, until they reached the Mediterranean ports from which Italian and other merchants distributed them further. The trade was not direct from producer to consumer. It passed through intermediaries across enormous distances, each adding value and extracting profit, creating a supply chain of remarkable geographic extent and logistical complexity. That supply chain was functioning throughout the medieval period because it was profitable, and profitable things tend to keep functioning even when other systems around them are struggling. The Mongol Empire, which at its 13th century height controlled an unbroken landmass from China to Eastern Europe, created conditions of relative political stability on the overland routes that made long-distance travel more possible than it had been in centuries and more possible than it would be again for some time after the empire fragmented. Merchants, diplomats, missionaries and adventurers moved along these routes with relative freedom during the Pax Mongolica, as historians call it, the Mongol Peace, which was peaceful mainly in the sense that the Mongols had already conquered most of the people along the route and had a strong institutional interest in maintaining the trade that made their empire profitable. Marco Polo's journey to China was not an anomaly or a miracle. It was an extension of existing networks, undertaken by a merchant family with existing connections, using infrastructure that was already in use. What made Polo unusual was that he wrote it all down in sufficient detail that Europeans who had never travelled found it extraordinary. The travel itself was not extraordinary, it was business. The movement of agricultural plants through medieval trade networks reshaped what people ate across vast areas in ways whose effects are still present in modern European cuisines. Crops introduced to Spain and Sicily by Arab farmers and traders, citrus fruits, sugarcane, cotton, rice, eggplants, spinach, apricots, spread gradually through European agriculture over the medieval period and transformed what was available for cooking and eating in ways that were permanent. The windmill, which transformed grain processing across northern Europe and freed enormous amounts of human and animal labour previously devoted to grinding by hand, appears to have entered the region partly through contact with Islamic engineering traditions carried along trade routes. Medieval technology transferred along medieval trade networks. The daily life of a 13th century English peasant was shaped by agricultural and technological developments that had originated in Islamic Persia and Arab Spain. The routes that carried them were medieval. The world that used them was more connected than it has ever been given credit for being. Medieval justice had a reputation for theatrical brutality, and that reputation was not entirely unearned. Trial by ordeal, submitting disputes to resolution through hot iron or cold water, on the theory that God would ensure the innocent party survived, was real and was used, though primarily in earlier periods and less universally than popular history suggests. Public executions were real. Punishments that read to modern eyes as disproportionate and cruel were real features of medieval legal practice in various times and places, enforced with a physical directness that the modern legal system has largely moved away from, or at least moved out of public sight. This should not be minimised or explained away. But medieval legal development during this same period was also producing frameworks, concepts, and institutions that directly shaped modern law in ways so fundamental that most people using the modern legal system are using medieval inventions without knowing it. The story of medieval justice is not only a story of hot irons and public spectacle. It is also a story of the slow, contested, imperfect, but real development of the idea that law should be consistent, that rulers are subject to it, and that individuals have rights that even powerful people cannot simply override. That story was medieval, and it matters. The Magna Carta, signed by King John of England in 1215, was in its immediate context a feudal document, a set of demands by powerful barons protecting their own privileges against a king who had overreached in ways they found financially intolerable. It was not a democratic manifesto or a human rights declaration in the modern sense, and reading it as one requires selective quotation, but its language included principles that later generations of lawyers and political philosophers found enormously generative, that the king was bound by law, that free men could not be imprisoned or dispossessed without due process, that justice should not be sold or delayed or denied. These principles were asserted in 1215 by people protecting their own interests, but they established a precedent that grew in later centuries into something much larger. Modern constitutionalism has medieval roots, and the Magna Carta is where some of those roots are most clearly visible. Medieval canon law, the legal system developed and administered by the Catholic Church across its jurisdictions, was one of the most sophisticated legal systems in the world during the high medieval period. It had its own courts, its own appellate structure, its own professional lawyers and judges, its own developed procedure for weighing evidence and reaching decisions. The Decretum of Gratian, compiled around 1140, was an attempt to systematize centuries of church legal tradition into a coherent body of law, essentially the creation of a legal code from accumulated precedent, the same intellectual project that Roman law had undertaken and that modern legal systems continue. The people who built canon law were learned jurists working in a tradition of genuine intellectual seriousness, and the procedural innovations they developed, including rules about evidence, about the rights of the accused to know the charges against them, about the standards required for conviction, influenced the development of secular legal systems in ways that persist today. The growth of commercial law in medieval cities produced yet another layer of legal development driven by practical necessity. Merchants conducting business across political and cultural boundaries needed reliable contracts, clear property rights, and mechanisms for resolving disputes that didn't require armies. They developed them. The Lex Mercatoria, the law merchant, was a body of commercial law developed by and for merchants, enforced through merchant courts that operated with reasonable speed and competence, because slow justice is economically useless to people with goods in transit. The legal instruments that medieval merchants created, the bill of exchange, the partnership contract, the insurance document, the letter of credit, were genuine legal innovations that responded to real commercial needs and that fed directly into the development of modern commercial law. You can draw a line from a medieval Venetian merchant's contract to a modern international trade agreement. The line is not straight, but it is continuous. Here is something true about any period of history, and something that the focus on grand events and decisive turning points consistently obscures. Most people, most of the time, were doing ordinary things. They were making food and eating it. They were maintaining friendships and occasionally ruining them. They were arguing with their relatives about decisions that seemed important in the moment and trivial in retrospect. They were falling in love, raising children, making small plans for next week, experiencing moments of unexpected beauty while walking somewhere mundane, and experiencing moments of grinding frustration when things they needed didn't work the way they were supposed to. These are the things that history books focused on the grand events that seemed important to the people recording them tend to leave out. And leaving them out creates the impression that people in the past were less fully human than people in the present, which is one of history's most persistent and least defensible errors. Medieval household accounts, letters, legal records, and inventories give us glimpses of ordinary life that complicate the Dark Ages narrative in specific and humanizing ways. Medieval parents worried about their children's futures and took concrete steps to improve them, apprenticing sons to skilled trades, arranging marriages with careful attention to the stability of the match, paying for schooling when they could, writing letters of recommendation to employers and patrons on behalf of children who needed a start. These are not the actions of people who thought life was simply suffering to be endured before a merciful death. They are the actions of people who believed the future was worth investing in, and who understood themselves to have responsibilities toward the specific small humans in their care. The Paston Letters, a collection of correspondence from a middle-class English family in the 15th century, gives an unusually detailed and unguarded picture of medieval daily life in a way that most historical documents, written for official purposes, do not. The family writes about legal disputes. Obviously, they were involved in several simultaneously, which was apparently a normal condition for anyone with property worth contesting in medieval England. But they also write about health, money, local gossip, the management of their estates, the romantic aspirations and disappointments of their children, and the small social negotiations of life in a community where everyone knew everyone and opinions travelled fast. Reading these letters, you do not feel like you're reading documents from an alien civilization. You feel like you're reading someone's email, except it was written on parchment with a quill pen and took several weeks to arrive, and the spelling is creative even by standards that predate standardized orthography. Medieval people celebrated. They had festivals, feasts and holidays. The liturgical calendar was packed with occasions that broke the routine of work and provided sanctioned opportunities for gathering, eating, drinking, music, games, and the specific social pleasure of being in public with other people for a purpose other than labour. Medieval fair culture was genuinely festive. Markets that were also entertainment, where travelling performers, musicians and vendors created an atmosphere of temporary abundance and collective enjoyment. People looked forward to these occasions in ways that are documented in letters and accounts that describe preparations, expectations, and post-event conversations. The anticipation of pleasure is not a modern invention. People in the medieval period felt it, expressed it, and organised their time around it. That is not consistent with a civilization sunk in darkness. It is consistent with human beings making the most of the time they have, which is what human beings do in every era without exception, regardless of what labels later historians attached to the centuries they lived in. Here is the argument in its clearest and most direct form. The Middle Ages did not interrupt the project of Western civilization. They continued it. They preserved what came before, extended it in new directions, resolved some of its problems, created new ones, and built the conditions from which everything that came after, the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, modern democracy, modern law, modern commerce, modern universities, could emerge. The Renaissance did not rescue civilization from darkness. It inherited a functioning civilization from the people who had been building it for 1,000 years and called it something new, which is understandable because people who build things like to get credit for them. But the foundation was medieval, and foundations matter. The Renaissance did not create itself from nothing. It built on a foundation of preserved classical texts, accumulated scholarly commentary, institutional infrastructure, and educational traditions that had been maintained and developed throughout the medieval period. When humanist scholars of the 15th century began reading classical texts with new enthusiasm and new interpretive approaches, they were reading texts that medieval monks had copied and medieval scholars had annotated and argued about for centuries. The texts existed because medieval people had kept them. The institutions where those scholars worked, the universities, the libraries, the patronage networks, had been built by medieval people and maintained by medieval people and refined by medieval people before the humanists arrived to use them. The Renaissance was standing on medieval ground. It just redecorated the house and told everyone it had built it from scratch. The universities that trained the thinkers of the scientific revolution were medieval institutions. Newton studied at Cambridge. Cambridge was founded in 1209, over 400 years before Newton arrived. Galileo taught at Padua. Padua's university was founded in 1222. Vesalius, who transformed anatomy, studied and taught at Padua as well. These institutions did not spring into existence to serve the scientific revolution. They had been developing, accumulating knowledge, training scholars, and building intellectual traditions for centuries before the revolution that supposedly marked the end of medieval ignorance. The revolution happened inside medieval institutions, using methods developed in medieval intellectual traditions, building on medieval data. It is not a repudiation of the medieval period, it is its continuation. Medieval philosophy, particularly the scholastic tradition, provided the logical and methodological tools that later thinkers built on and, in many cases, needed to argue against explicitly to make their positions clear. You cannot fully understand Descartes' philosophical method without understanding what it was in dialogue with. You cannot fully understand the development of empirical science as a deliberate methodology without understanding the medieval tradition of natural philosophy that it was simultaneously extending and critiquing. The intellectual arguments of the early modern period were not starting from nothing. They were arguing with specific medieval positions, refining specific medieval methods, rejecting specific medieval conclusions while retaining the frameworks that made those conclusions possible in the first place. The roots go deep. They go medieval. Every modern person who has benefited from a university education, used a contract, been protected by a legal right, or listened to music written in a Western notation system is using things that passed through the medieval period on the way to them. The darkness was always partial, always contested, and always less complete than the name implied. In the middle of everything that was genuinely difficult about medieval life, the disease, the hard physical labour, the political instability, the material scarcity, the medieval garden was a small, deliberate act of civilization. Not just a practical response to the need for food and medicine, though it was also that, but something more intentional, a space shaped by human care and human aesthetic judgment into something better than what would have existed without that care. The medieval garden was proof that people in the most constrained circumstances still found ways to make beauty, still carved out corners of the world and made them ordered and pleasant, still decided that the world should contain things that existed purely because they were good to look at. That impulse is not a small thing. That impulse is what civilization is built from. Monastery gardens were the most organised and best documented, and they were remarkable institutions. They were typically divided into several distinct sections: the physic garden for medicinal plants, the kitchen garden for vegetables and herbs used in cooking, the orchard for fruit, and the pleasure garden or hortus conclusus, the enclosed garden, which was primarily aesthetic and contemplative in purpose. The hortus conclusus appears frequently in medieval religious art as a symbol of paradise, and the actual gardens that inspired those images were carefully designed spaces with fountains or water features, raised beds edged in stone or wood, trellises supporting climbing plants, turf seats, and flowering plants chosen for both their visual qualities and their symbolic associations. These were not utilitarian plots grudgingly maintained. They were spaces designed to produce a specific experience in the person who entered them, an experience of order, beauty, and temporary separation from the difficult world outside the enclosing walls. In other words, a garden in exactly the sense that word still carries. The range of plants grown in medieval gardens was considerably wider than the grey porridge school of medieval history would predict. Medicinal gardens kept herbs and plants with documented therapeutic uses: lavender for headaches and anxiety, comfrey for wound healing, feverfew for fevers, yarrow to stanch bleeding, chamomile for digestive trouble, valerian for sleep disturbance. The monks and nuns who tended these gardens were, in functional terms, pharmacists, maintaining a living stock of therapeutic materials, understanding their properties and preparation, and applying that knowledge to the people who came seeking help. The garden was not separate from the hospital. It was the hospital's supply chain, cultivated with the kind of attention that comes from understanding that what grows here will affect whether sick people recover or don't. Beyond the monastery, the gardens of medieval nobles and prosperous merchants were spaces of deliberate pleasure as well as practical use. Medieval love poetry is persistently full of gardens. They appear as the setting for romantic encounters, for private conversations, for moments of emotional candour that wouldn't be possible in the more public spaces of the house or court. This isn't accidental. Gardens were designed to function this way, as spaces where the normal rules of social interaction were slightly loosened by the privacy of enclosing walls and the softening effect of greenery and water and flowers. Medieval garden design understood what psychologists now describe as restorative environments, spaces whose qualities reduce stress, invite reflection, and allow the mind to ease. They didn't call it that. They just noticed that sitting in the garden felt better than not sitting in the garden, and they built accordingly. That is not primitive thinking. That is applied human wisdom that every modern person who has ever felt better after spending time outside has independently confirmed. The medieval Catholic Church occupies a genuinely complicated position in any honest account of the period, and honesty requires holding that complexity rather than resolving it prematurely in either direction. The Church was responsible for the Inquisition and the suffering it caused. It was responsible for the Crusades and the violence they inflicted. It exercised coercive power over people's lives, thoughts, and bodies in ways that caused real harm to real people, and its institutional interests were not always, or even usually, identical with the well-being of the people nominally in its care. Its history includes abuses of power that were systematic, prolonged, and defended by the people committing them in terms that should not be rehabilitated. All of that is true, and should remain true in any account that wants to be taken seriously. And also true is this. For most medieval people, in most places, for most of the medieval period, the parish church was the most important communal institution in their lives, and what it provided went considerably beyond religious services in the narrow sense. Understanding what the church actually was to most medieval people, as opposed to what its most powerful figures did with institutional authority, requires looking at the parish level, at the village church with its priest who baptized your children and buried your dead and provided the only formal education available in the community, and at what that institution meant to people whose lives were lived almost entirely within walking distance of it. Churches were often the only public buildings in small villages, the only spaces large enough to gather the whole community for any purpose beyond the purely agricultural. They hosted markets. They provided shelter to travellers who would otherwise have had nowhere to sleep. They were places of asylum for people fleeing violence, which was a genuinely useful social function in a world where violence was not always preventable. The churchyard was the community's burial ground, which meant it was the space where people went to maintain connection with their dead, to visit graves, to remember the specific individuals who had been part of their lives, and to situate their own brief existence within a longer human continuity that the presence of ancestral graves made physically real. That is not a purely religious function. That is a deeply human one. Monasteries and convents ran the hospitals that existed in medieval Europe, and their existence is worth noting, because the instinct to create institutions specifically dedicated to caring for sick and vulnerable people does not arise automatically in every society. The word hospital comes from the same Latin root as hospitality and hostel. It meant a place that received those in need, which originally included the sick, the elderly, the poor, and travellers as well as people with specific illnesses. Medieval hospitals were not hospitals in the modern clinical sense. They could not offer what modern medicine offers, and some of what they offered was ineffective. But they were real institutions, staffed by people whose specific vocation was to care for others, providing warmth, food, companionship, and whatever medical knowledge was available to people who would otherwise have faced illness and dying without any institutional support at all. The people who built and ran those institutions believed that caring for the vulnerable was an obligation, not a choice. That belief, expressed in stone and staffing and daily labour across centuries, deserves to be acknowledged as part of what the medieval church was, alongside the things it was that deserve criticism. Both are true, neither cancels the other. History rarely offers the clean moral ledger that retrospective judgment wants. Pilgrimage was one of the most significant forms of travel in the medieval world, and it was remarkably widespread across social classes in ways that few other activities managed to be. People who could not ordinarily afford to travel long distances, people who had never left their home village and might not leave it again for any other reason, would make journeys of hundreds or thousands of miles to visit sacred sites, walking, riding, sailing, begging food and shelter along the way, enduring weather and fatigue and the genuine physical difficulty of moving through a world without modern infrastructure. They did this because they believed it mattered spiritually, and that belief drove a remarkable amount of human movement and social mixing across what might otherwise have been an extremely static and localized society. The Pilgrim Road was one of the few spaces in the medieval world where a peasant and a nobleman might sleep in the same hostel and eat at the same table and have a conversation that normal social hierarchy would never have produced. The great pilgrimage routes to Canterbury in England, to Santiago de Compostela in Spain, to Rome, and for those with the means and courage for the longest journey, to Jerusalem itself, were maintained over centuries by the practical infrastructure their traffic required. Hospices built specifically for pilgrims provided food and shelter at regular intervals along the major routes. Bridges were constructed and maintained partly to facilitate pilgrim movement across rivers that would otherwise have required dangerous fording. Roads that might have fallen into disrepair without consistent use were kept functional by the steady stream of foot traffic they carried. Towns along the major routes built their economies around the pilgrim trade. Inns, taverns, vendors of food, souvenirs, religious badges and small relics positioned themselves to catch the attention and the money of people passing through. This was an economy sustained entirely by spiritual motivation, which is not a combination that the Dark Ages narrative tends to make room for. The Camino de Santiago, the way of St. James leading to the cathedral at Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, was one of the busiest and best organised routes. At its medieval height, it carried tens of thousands of pilgrims annually from across Europe, speaking different languages, coming from different social positions, united by the common purpose of the journey and the common experience of the road. Guidebooks were produced for the Camino as early as the 12th century. The Codex Calixtinus includes a pilgrim's guide that describes the route, identifies good and bad water sources, warns about untrustworthy innkeepers, and provides practical information about local customs and conditions. A medieval travel guide, written for people who were travelling. Because people were travelling, in large numbers, with specific needs for reliable information. The Pilgrim Road was not a metaphor. It was a physical infrastructure with a real user base and a growing body of supporting literature. Pilgrimage also created social mixing that was genuinely unusual in a hierarchically organised society. On the road, the normal markers of social position, dress, speech, occupation, the specific geography of one's birth, were partially suspended by the shared identity of being a pilgrim, which was a category that cut across ordinary social divisions in ways that were recognised and remarked upon at the time. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales takes this social mixing as its fundamental premise, a group of pilgrims from every social level telling each other stories as they travel together, and finds in that mixing the full comic and tragic range of human personality, from the genuinely devout to the casually corrupt and everyone in between. Chaucer found the road to Canterbury funny and sad and recognisably human, because it was all of those things. The pilgrims he observed and invented were not Dark Age figures. They were people making a journey together, telling stories, arguing, flirting, showing off, and behaving exactly as people behave when they are temporarily freed from the fixed roles of ordinary life. Which is to say, they were people. Entirely, recognisably, entertainingly people. Medieval people were doing mathematics. This is not a controversial statement among historians who work on the period, but it tends to get lost in the general cultural narrative of a pre-scientific age in which people were primarily occupied with theological speculation and avoiding the plague. The mathematics they were doing was not always presented or categorized the way modern mathematics is. It was embedded in practical problems of commerce and construction, in theological and philosophical speculation about infinity and continuity, and in astronomical observation and calculation that required genuine numerical sophistication. But it was real mathematics, performed by people who understood what they were doing and several of its contributions were so fundamental that we use them daily without noticing their medieval origin. The adoption of Arabic numerals in medieval Europe was a mathematical revolution of the first order, and it is worth pausing to appreciate how revolutionary it actually was. Prior to this adoption, European mathematicians and merchants were working with Roman numerals, a system that is perfectly adequate for recording quantities but genuinely terrible for performing calculations. Try multiplying MCX SOR by CC using Roman numeral arithmetic, and you will quickly understand why the adoption of a positional number system with a 0 was not a minor administrative update. It was a transformation in what calculation was possible at all, and in how quickly and reliably it could be performed. The introduction of Arabic numerals to Western European mathematics is associated primarily with Leonardo of Pisa, known as Fibonacci, who presented the system in his Liber Abaci in 1202 with demonstrations of its utility for commercial calculation that were immediately convincing to anyone who tried them. This was a medieval mathematician introducing a medieval mathematical revolution that changed how every subsequent generation would do arithmetic. Fibonacci is also associated with the sequence that bears his name, the series of numbers in which each term is the sum of the two that precede it, which appears in plant growth patterns, spiral shell geometries, and various natural phenomena, and which has generated centuries of mathematical investigation into its properties. Fibonacci discovered and described this sequence while working on a practical problem about rabbit population growth, which is the kind of origin story that makes mathematics professors happy, because it demonstrates that paying careful attention to specific numbers for practical reasons sometimes reveals deep structural properties that nobody was specifically looking for. That is not how mathematics is supposed to work, and it is how mathematics has frequently worked throughout its history, including in its medieval phase. Medieval architects were doing applied geometry continuously, and at a level of sophistication that their results make undeniable. The proportional systems used to design Gothic cathedrals, determining the relationships between height, width, and depth, managing the distribution of structural forces across complex three-dimensional forms, calculating the precise geometry of vaulted ceilings that would distribute weight correctly and still look beautiful, required mathematical understanding that the practitioners couldn't always articulate in formal terms but demonstrably possessed, because the buildings they produced using that understanding have stood for 8 centuries. The masons who built Gothic cathedrals worked from geometric principles transmitted through guild apprenticeship, principles about the properties of specific triangles and ratios that controlled the proportions of the whole building. They didn't write equations. They drew on tracing floors with compasses and straight edges, and produced results that modern structural engineers can analyze and confirm. The understanding was real. The form it was expressed in was different from modern mathematical notation. The difference in form does not change the underlying reality, which is that medieval builders were solving mathematical problems of genuine complexity and solving them correctly. Medieval commercial mathematics also deserves recognition. The double-entry bookkeeping system developed by Italian merchants in the 13th and 14th centuries is a mathematical framework for tracking financial transactions that remains the foundation of modern accounting. The bills of exchange and letters of credit developed by medieval bankers required mathematical reasoning about interest, risk, and the time value of money. These were not simple calculations performed by unsophisticated people. They were sophisticated financial instruments developed by people who understood numbers well enough to build systems that managed risk and enabled commerce across vast distances without the physical movement of coin. The mathematics was embedded in commerce because commerce required it. The Middle Ages produced it because commerce demanded it. And the systems they built have never been replaced, only extended. Medieval theology is often described as if it were simple, uniform, and fundamentally resistant to genuine thought. A closed system in which all questions had predetermined answers enforced by institutional authority, and in which anyone who asked inconvenient questions did so at serious personal risk. God made the world, the Bible explained it, the Church enforced the explanation, and anyone who suggested complications was in serious trouble. This picture is not entirely fabricated. The Inquisition existed, heresy prosecutions were real, and the institutional church did exercise coercive authority over intellectual life in ways that limited what could be safely expressed in some times and places. Minimizing that would be dishonest. But medieval theology was also, during this same period, one of the most vigorously contested and genuinely open intellectual fields of the entire era. Theologians argued about everything: the relationship between faith and reason, the nature of the soul and its relationship to the body, the problem of evil and how a good God could permit it, the mechanics of free will, the proper interpretation of obscure scriptural passages, the extent of papal authority, the nature of universals, the metaphysics of the Eucharist. These were not small arguments about minor points on which everyone was expected to agree. They were big, fundamental arguments about the nature of reality, conducted in writing and in person with considerable intellectual seriousness and genuine disagreement, and the people conducting them reached different conclusions that they were willing to defend against objection. The conflict between nominalism and realism, the debate about whether universal concepts like redness or humanity have independent existence or are merely names applied to collections of particular things that resemble each other, was one of the most significant philosophical arguments of the medieval period, and it is worth noting that it has never been definitively resolved. Philosophers and cognitive scientists are still arguing about related questions today in technical language that is different from the medieval Latin, but addresses problems that are recognizably the same. The medieval scholars who developed the positions in this debate, William of Ockham arguing for nominalism, Aquinas and others for versions of realism, were working on a hard problem with real intellectual rigour and arriving at positions that were genuinely different from each other. That is what philosophy looks like when it is working. It does not look like unanimous agreement enforced by authority. Medieval mysticism represents a dimension of intellectual and spiritual life that fits even less comfortably into the ignorant and superstitious narrative than scholastic philosophy does. Meister Eckhart in Germany, Julian of Norwich in England, Hildegard of Bingen in the Rhineland, Mechthild of Magdeburg, Catherine of Siena. These were people who had profound inner experiences of what they understood as direct encounter with the divine, and who then wrote about those experiences with psychological precision and philosophical sophistication that is genuinely remarkable. Julian of Norwich, writing after a series of visions she experienced during a near-fatal illness in 1373, produced the Revelations of Divine Love, a sustained theological meditation that is both personally intimate and philosophically serious, and which contains some of the most carefully reasoned arguments in medieval theology about the nature of divine love and the problem of sin. Her formulation, "all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well," is sometimes quoted as a comfort without its context, which is that Julian wrote it as a theological conclusion, carefully argued in the 14th century, while the Black Death was within living memory, and her own body had nearly killed her. The comfort is hard-won. It is also intellectually serious. Those two things are not in tension, and the fact that they can coexist in the work of a medieval anchoress is one of the better arguments against the darkness of the age she lived in. The word peasant carries a weight of passive helplessness in modern usage that the historical reality of medieval peasants does not fully support. It conjures an image of someone entirely at the mercy of circumstances beyond their control, bound to the land, subject to the arbitrary authority of a lord who could demand labour and extract taxes without meaningful limit, with no recourse, no choices, and no capacity to change their situation in any meaningful way. The structural constraints that medieval peasants faced were genuinely severe by modern standards, and presenting those constraints honestly is important. But the historical record also shows medieval peasants negotiating, complaining through available channels, organising, resisting, and occasionally winning, doing, in other words, what people in constrained circumstances have always done, which is find and use whatever leverage is available to them. Peasants sued in manorial courts. This is one of the most humanising facts that medieval legal records reveal, because suing requires believing you have a right that has been violated, and believing that a formal process can potentially vindicate that right. Both of those beliefs require a level of agency and legal consciousness that the passive victim model of peasant life doesn't predict. Manorial court records across medieval England and elsewhere show ordinary people bringing complaints against landlords for excessive demands, against neighbours for specific wrongs, against officials for corrupt behaviour. They argued their cases, they brought witnesses, they cited custom, the established practices of the manor that were understood to have the force of informal law, and that could be invoked against lords who tried to exceed them. They sometimes won. The existence of this record does not mean that medieval justice was reliably fair, or that peasants were protected by anything resembling modern legal rights. It means that the relationship between peasants and authority was not simply one of complete domination and complete submission. It was negotiated, contested, and occasionally reversed. Collective action was also more developed than is often recognised. When conditions became genuinely intolerable, when new taxes were imposed without precedent, when serfdom was enforced more stringently than custom allowed, when lords failed to provide protection in exchange for the labour they demanded, peasant communities organised responses that were not merely spontaneous eruptions of desperation, but coordinated actions with specific objectives. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 had demands, specific articulable demands about the abolition of serfdom, the reduction of taxes, the punishment of corrupt officials, and the right to rent land freely rather than on obligatory terms. The rebels marched to London. They presented their demands to the king in person. They extracted promises that were subsequently broken, which is the normal outcome of peasant revolts in this period and in most others, but the articulation of specific demands and the organised action to press them is not consistent with a population that had no concept of its own rights or interests. Village communities also had internal governance structures that operated largely independently of manorial authority on many questions of daily life. Village assemblies made collective decisions about crop rotation schedules, the use of common land for grazing, the maintenance of shared drainage and irrigation infrastructure, the resolution of local disputes between neighbours. These were not imposed from above. They were communities organising themselves to manage shared resources in ways that required discussion, negotiation, and the development of binding collective decisions. The medieval village was not a collection of isolated households, each subject individually to the lord above them. It was a community with its own internal governance, its own norms, and its own capacity for collective action. The lord was a powerful external constraint on that community. He was not its only organising principle. The people inside the village had relationships with each other that were not mediated by the lord, and that gave them resources, solidarity, shared knowledge, collective capacity, that pure structural analysis of their legal position misses. Medieval peasants were not simply victims of their circumstances. They were people in difficult circumstances making the most of what they had, which is what people do, in every era, without exception. Here is where we end up, after 2 hours of travelling through a period that deserves to be remembered better than it is, by more people than currently remember it well. The Middle Ages were not a 1,000-year failure. They were not a pause between two better things. They were not darkness waiting to be interrupted by light from outside. They were 1,000 years of human life, complicated, imperfect, sometimes genuinely terrible, frequently remarkable, and always recognisably human in its concerns, its pleasures, its griefs, and its stubborn insistence on building things that might outlast the people who built them. The people of the medieval world faced problems we recognise without needing translation. They faced illness without adequate tools to treat it, and they built hospitals anyway and staffed them with people whose entire vocation was care. They faced the loss of knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate, and they copied books by hand in cold rooms until the knowledge was safe. They faced the challenge of governing large and complex societies, and they developed legal systems, representative institutions, commercial frameworks, and educational structures that are still with us in forms that are direct descendants of what they made. They faced the difficulty of making sense of existence in a world that provided no easy answers, and they produced philosophy, theology, and literature of genuine depth and lasting power. They were doing what every generation does, trying to understand the world they found themselves in, trying to make it a little better, trying to take care of the people they loved, and trying to leave something behind that mattered. They made music that still moves people who hear it. They wrote books that still make people laugh and still make people cry, in the original languages and in translations that demonstrate the continuing relevance of what was being said. They planted gardens that were beautiful and not just useful, because beauty is a human need, and they knew it as well as any gardener knows it now. They fell in love and wrote about it with a specificity and tenderness that crosses 1,000 years without losing anything essential. The troubadour poems are still recognisable as love poems, which means the emotional experience they describe is still recognisable, which means the people who wrote them were feeling things that we still feel. That is not a small observation. That is continuity of human experience across a period that is supposed to have been characterised by its break from everything recognisable. They argued with each other about the nature of reality, with an intellectual seriousness that should command respect, even from people who think they reach the wrong conclusions. They built cathedrals that still stop people in their tracks with involuntary wonder. They developed the mathematical tools, the institutional structures, and the accumulated empirical knowledge that made the subsequent centuries of scientific and cultural achievement possible. They were afraid of things that deserved to be feared, and they found joy in things that deserved joy, and they made communities out of the difficult material of people with competing interests, and somehow managed to produce, out of those communities, things that were better than any of their members could have produced alone. The darkness was always a label, not a description. It was applied by people who wanted to make their own moment look brighter by comparison, and it has been repeated for 7 centuries by people who absorbed it without questioning it, which is the most human of all intellectual errors and the easiest one to correct. The correction is simply to look at the manuscripts and the music and the mathematics and the legal documents and the letters and the gardens and the buildings and see what is actually there. What is actually there is not darkness. What is actually there is people, in all their complication, building civilization one imperfect piece at a time, exactly as people have always done, exactly as people are doing right now, in whatever century the person reading these words happens to be living in. When people imagine medieval urban life, they tend to imagine something small, muddy, and vaguely threatening. A few crooked streets, some hovels of dubious structural integrity, a market square with produce of ambiguous freshness, and an omnipresent smell of things that have been near animals for too long. Parts of this are accurate. Medieval cities were, by modern standards, extremely dense, not designed with waste management as a primary concern, and not particularly focused on traffic flow. None of this is disputed. The mud was real, the smell was real, the chickens in the street were real. But medieval cities were also extraordinarily alive in ways that the muddy hovel's image completely fails to capture, and that aliveness was not incidental to what cities were in the medieval period, it was the whole point of them. Cities existed because they were where things happened. They were centres of commerce, craft, culture and political life in ways that drew people to them despite the density and the smell and the genuine practical difficulties of urban medieval existence. And the people they drew were doing things that were interesting, skilled, competitive, and often innovative in ways that changed the world outside the city walls. Medieval cities were organised in ways that looked chaotic from the outside, but had internal logic that reflected real functional needs. Trades clustered together not by accident, but because clustering made economic sense. Being near your suppliers and your customers reduced transaction costs that mattered in an economy where every journey took time and effort. The tanners were near the river because tanning required large quantities of water, and because the smell was best managed by putting it where the wind and water would carry it away from everyone else. The goldsmiths and jewellers were near the main market because their customers needed to find them easily. The cloth merchants were in covered halls because cloth needed protection from weather that outdoor markets couldn't reliably provide. This is urban planning in a pre-theoretical form, the accumulated result of thousands of individual decisions that gradually produced a functional organisation, not unlike how modern cities organise themselves around transportation nodes and commercial clusters, just without the consultants. City governments were more developed than is often recognised, and the forms they took were more varied and more interesting than a lord who owned everything. Medieval cities in northern Italy developed forms of communal self-government, the commune, in which elected councils of citizens made decisions about taxation, public works, legal matters, and foreign relations with a degree of collective participation that was unprecedented in medieval Europe and that directly influenced the political thought of later centuries. Figures like Marsilius of Padua, writing in the 14th century about the proper basis of political authority, were theorising about government in a context shaped by the actual experience of communal self-governance in Italian cities. The ideas that later fed into modern democratic theory were not invented in a vacuum. They were developed by people thinking carefully about political institutions that they could actually observe functioning or failing around them. Medieval guild culture produced city communities that were more than economic arrangements. Guilds organised feasts, funded religious observances, maintained chapels, provided for the widows and orphans of members, arbitrated internal disputes, and created social bonds between people who worked in the same trade that extended well beyond the purely professional. The Corpus Christi processions that were organised by city guilds in England and elsewhere were major public theatrical events, elaborate performances involving multiple guilds, each responsible for staging a specific scene that could last all day, and involved the entire city as both participants and audience. These were civic performances on a scale that required coordination, funding, rehearsal, and genuine artistic ambition. They were medieval cities expressing civic pride and communal identity through collective creative effort. That is not the behaviour of a Dark Age population. That is a community that has organised itself well enough to do something beautiful together. There is a theory, advanced by certain historians in the 20th century, and since substantially revised by subsequent scholarship, that had the benefit of actually reading more of the available evidence, that medieval people did not experience childhood as a distinct phase of life. The argument held that children were simply treated as small adults from the moment they could walk, put to work, expected to manage adult responsibilities, pushed through infancy as quickly as possible toward productive labour, and regarded by their parents with the kind of emotional detachment that comes from not expecting them to survive. This theory was always more dramatic than the evidence supported, and the evidence against it is extensive enough that it has been largely abandoned by specialists, though it continues to circulate in popular history books and dinner party conversations because it has the appeal of being both shocking and simple. Medieval children played. The archaeological evidence is unambiguous and has been accumulating steadily as urban excavations across Europe continue to produce the physical remnants of medieval childhood. Spinning tops, wooden horses and cattle made to scale for small hands, miniature clay cooking vessels too small for any functional use, exactly the right size for a child playing adult domestic life. Marbles in multiple materials, clay, stone, glass. Small figurines, balls, hoops, toy knights fashioned from lead alloy, clearly made to be handled and moved around in the kind of imaginative play that children engage in with toy soldiers in any period. These objects were not accidental inclusions in the archaeological record. They were made specifically for children, used by children, and discarded or lost in the way that toys are discarded and lost, which is to say, everywhere, buried in layers that reflect the ordinary accumulation of daily life. Someone made them. Children played with them. Adults permitted this, which is the simplest possible evidence that a period of childhood play was considered normal and appropriate. Medieval law recognised developmental difference in ways that reflect an understanding of childhood as a genuinely distinct phase of life. Canon law set different minimum ages for various significant acts: marriage, taking religious vows, bearing witness in court, on the explicit basis that younger people lacked the judgment and understanding that those acts required. Children were generally not held to adult standards of legal responsibility for crimes. Medical writers addressed children's health as a specialised subject with its own considerations, different dosages for medicines, different dietary recommendations, specific attention to the diseases and conditions that were most common in early life. None of this describes a society that viewed children simply as small adults. It describes a society that understood childhood as different and organised its practices accordingly. Medieval literature is full of children who are treated as children, whose vulnerability is a source of emotional weight, whose deaths are grieved in terms that are fully legible across the centuries, whose play and innocence are described with an affection that doesn't require any translation to be understood. The grief of parents who lost children in medieval documents is not a performed formality. It is recognisable grief, expressed in the specific personal language that loss produces in people who have loved what they lost. The parents of the medieval period loved their children. The evidence is everywhere, in wills that made careful provision for minor children, in letters that track their health and progress with anxious attention, in the small graves that have been found across the continent, furnished with the toys and food and objects that parents believed their children might need or want. The objects in those graves are the most direct possible statement of parental love, the impulse to send something of value, along with the child, into whatever comes after death. That impulse is not a Dark Age impulse, it is the oldest human impulse there is. Latin was the official language of the medieval church, of scholarship, of law and of diplomacy, the common written medium of educated Europeans across linguistic boundaries that would otherwise have made intellectual exchange between, say, an English monk and a Spanish theologian essentially impossible. This shared Latin infrastructure was a genuine intellectual achievement, maintaining a space of common discourse across an enormous and linguistically diverse geographic area for 1,000 years, and its importance for the transmission of knowledge across that space cannot be overstated. Medieval Latin scholarship was substantial, sophisticated, and produced in enormous quantity by people who had mastered a language that was not their native tongue to a degree that allowed them to think in it with precision and elegance. But this is sometimes taken to mean that the vernacular languages, the French, German, Italian, English, Spanish, Catalan, Provençal, Welsh, and dozens of other regional tongues that people actually spoke at home, were somehow suppressed or diminished during the medieval period, existing only at a basic level of everyday communication, while serious expression happened exclusively in Latin. The reality is almost the opposite. The medieval period was the great formative era of most of the major European vernacular literary traditions, and the languages that would become the vehicles of the most celebrated literature in European history were being written down, developed as literary instruments, and used to produce major works of enduring significance precisely during the centuries that are labelled dark. The Old English poem Beowulf survives in a manuscript produced around the year 1000, and was composed sometime before that, possibly as early as the 8th century, though scholars disagree about the date in ways that reflect genuine uncertainty rather than evasiveness. It is an epic poem of considerable ambition, drawing on Germanic heroic tradition and oral poetry conventions while incorporating the influence of Christian thought in ways that are not simple overlay but genuine synthesis. It operates in a literary register of sophistication that challenges modern readers who encounter it for the first time, not because it is primitive, but because it deploys conventions, kennings, alliterative metre, the elegiac tone, the complex treatment of heroism and fate that require some orientation to appreciate fully. It is not a simple document. It is a sophisticated poem, and it was made in the early medieval period by someone who had mastered both the formal requirements of the tradition and the specific demands of the story they were telling. Dante Alighieri began the Divine Comedy around 1308, writing in Italian at a moment when Italian was still establishing itself as a literary language for serious subjects. This was a conscious and deliberate choice. Dante was making an argument, through his language selection, that the vernacular could carry the highest intellectual and spiritual content that had previously been reserved for Latin. The argument succeeded in the most complete possible way. The Divine Comedy is one of the great works of world literature in any language, read and studied and translated across 7 centuries, and it made Italian into a literary language that shaped the entire subsequent tradition of European vernacular writing. It is a medieval work. It was produced by a medieval mind, shaped by medieval theology, medieval philosophy, medieval political thought, and medieval poetic tradition. It is not an early Renaissance work that happens to have been completed before the Renaissance is conventionally said to have started. It is the medieval tradition at its fullest expression, and it is extraordinary. The troubadour lyric tradition in Provençal French developed from the late 11th century and spread through courts across southern France, northern Italy, and eventually into German, Catalan, and Portuguese variants. It was the most influential secular literary tradition of the medieval period, and its influence on the subsequent history of European love poetry, the Italian sonnet, and the entire Western tradition of lyric poetry cannot be overstated. When later poets wrote about love, in the Renaissance, in the Baroque, in the Romantic period now, they were writing in forms and using conventions that were developed by medieval poets working in Provençal French. The darkness, here as elsewhere, was in the label, the light was in the poems. The image of medieval international relations as primarily a matter of armies marching and swords meeting misses a substantial reality that the historical record makes clear once you look at it directly. Medieval rulers spent enormous amounts of time, money, and skilled human labour on diplomacy, and the diplomatic culture of the medieval world was sophisticated, procedurally developed, and institutionally sustained in ways that the war-focused narrative almost entirely obscures. Wars happened. They were sometimes long and destructive. They were also usually preceded by extensive negotiation, accompanied by parallel diplomatic efforts, and followed by treaty-making that required legal and linguistic expertise that was very much a medieval specialty. The medieval world was not one in which conflict was the default state. It was one in which conflict was managed, imperfectly, frequently unsuccessfully, but with genuine institutional effort, through a developed culture of diplomatic practice. Papal diplomacy was perhaps the most extensive diplomatic network operating in the medieval world, and its reach was genuinely impressive by any standard. The Pope maintained permanent or semi-permanent representatives, legates, nuncios, and later resident ambassadors at courts across Europe and beyond, providing ongoing communication, negotiating disputes between rulers who would not communicate directly, carrying messages, gathering intelligence, and attempting to coordinate collective action on matters the Church considered to require European-wide responses. The Crusades required the mobilization of military forces from dozens of different political units, speaking different languages under no single political authority, an organizational achievement that, whatever one thinks of the Crusades themselves, required diplomatic capacity of a high order to even attempt. The papacy provided that capacity through a standing diplomatic service that operated continuously for centuries. Secular rulers also maintained active diplomatic correspondence that was considerably more organized and sophisticated than the occasional letter carried by a trusted messenger. Medieval kings kept professional scribes whose specific function was the drafting and management of diplomatic correspondence in appropriately formal Latin. They sent embassies, formal delegations with specific mandates, instructions, and the authority to negotiate within defined limits, to foreign courts for purposes ranging from marriage negotiations to trade agreements to military alliances. The archives of major medieval states contain thousands of diplomatic documents produced by this activity. Letters, treaties, safe conducts, marriage contracts, commercial agreements, letters of credence establishing the authority of ambassadors. This is a documentary record of sustained diplomatic activity, and it is not small. The Byzantine Empire, which preserved the traditions of the Eastern Roman state through 1,000 years of medieval history until its fall in 1453, was perhaps the most diplomatically sophisticated polity of the entire period. Byzantine diplomacy was famously elaborate, based on careful management of prestige, ceremonial display, strategic gift-giving, the manipulation of religious and dynastic symbolism, and a detailed intelligence-gathering operation that tracked the political situation at foreign courts with impressive precision. Byzantine diplomats were trained professionals who understood the cultures they were dealing with, spoke relevant languages, and operated from an institutional framework of considerable depth and sophistication. The word Byzantine has come in modern usage to mean unnecessarily complicated and devious, which is a backhanded tribute to how effective their diplomatic system appeared to the people who encountered it from outside. They were good at it. They had been practicing for a very long time, and the traditions they developed influenced diplomatic practice across the medieval world, including in the Italian city-states that developed the institution of the resident ambassador, the permanent diplomatic presence in a foreign capital that became the foundation of modern international diplomacy. We are still using that institution. It is medieval, and so here we are. At the end of a very long journey through 1,000 years that someone once had the audacity to call dark, you've travelled through cold scriptoriums where monks hunched over parchment by candlelight, saving the words of people who had been dead for centuries because someone had to, and they decided it would be them. You've stood at the base of cathedrals that should not, by any reasonable engineering logic, still be standing, and yet there they are, 800 years later, still stopping people in their tracks. You've walked the pilgrim roads with farmers and nobles and merchants and con artists, all headed in the same direction for reasons that were sometimes holy, and sometimes considerably less so. You've sat in medieval lecture halls where scholars argued themselves hoarse about the nature of reality, in universities that are still universities today, teaching in buildings that are older than most countries. You've heard the music, you've read the jokes, you've seen the toys buried in small graves by parents who couldn't bear to send their children into the unknown without something familiar to hold. You've watched women run estates and write books and argue with emperors and build institutions and refuse, repeatedly and often at significant personal cost, to be invisible. You've seen peasants sue their lords in court and win, which is not something Dark Age people are supposed to be able to do, and yet they did it, because people in constrained circumstances find the available leverage, and they use it, and they always have. None of this was simple, none of it was clean. The medieval world was genuinely hard in ways that deserve honest acknowledgement rather than romantic softening. The disease was real, the poverty was real, the injustice was real, and the people who lived through the worst of it suffered in ways that should not be minimized in the service of a more flattering historical narrative. The darkness in the Dark Ages was not invented. It was real, in the places and times where it was real. But it was never the whole story. It was never even most of the story. Most of the story was people, ordinary, complicated, funny, grieving, ambitious, stubborn, creative people, getting up every morning in a world that offered them fewer tools than we have, and doing the best they could with what they had. Building things, fixing things, making things more beautiful than they needed to be, because beauty is a human need and they knew it. Keeping the fire alive through the night so that the people they loved would be warm in the morning. They kept the fire alive for us too, in ways they couldn't have known and couldn't have planned, in the texts they copied, the institutions they built, the ideas they argued for, the precedents they set. Every warm thing in your life that has roots in human civilization has some of those roots in the medieval period, whether you can see them or not. The floor you're standing on goes medieval if you follow it down far enough. So tonight, as you ease into sleep in whatever comfortable corner of the modern world you've arranged for yourself, with your thermostat and your running water and your mattress that does not contain active ecosystems, maybe spare a quiet thought for the people who held the line, the monk in the cold room, the mason who would never see the finished cathedral, the peasant woman who ran the farm while everyone assumed someone else was in charge, the scholar who argued in careful Latin that the king was not above the law, the poet who decided that love deserved to be written down in the language people actually spoke, because some things are too important for Latin. They did their part. They passed things forward. They kept enough of the light alive that the people who came after them could call it a renaissance, could look at what had been preserved and built and maintained through 1,000 difficult years and decide, somewhat unfairly, that it looked like a rebirth. It wasn't a rebirth. It was a continuation. And the people who made it possible deserve to be remembered not as inhabitants of the darkness, but as what they actually were. People doing the work in the time they were given, just like everyone else. Sleep well.